Most Americans grow up learning a simple story. The Civil War was about slavery. The North fought to end it. The South fought to preserve it. Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves, and the Union was saved. That story is not exactly wrong, but it is dangerously incomplete. Because if the Civil War was simply about slavery, then we have to ask a question that historians have been avoiding for over 150 years. Why did it take so long? Why did the war happen when it did? In 1861, after slavery had existed in America for nearly 250 years. Slavery had been part of American life since the first English settlers arrived at Jamestown in 1619. It survived the American Revolution. It survived the writing of the Constitution. It survived the administrations of George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and Andrew Jackson. It survived decades of compromise and political maneuvering. So why did it finally break the nation in half? That is the puzzle we are about to solve. And to understand the answer, we have to go back to the very beginning, to the moment when the United States was created, because the seeds of the Civil War were planted before the nation even existed. When the Founding Fathers gathered in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787, they faced an impossible challenge. They had to create a government strong enough to hold 13 very different states together, but not so strong that it would become a new tyranny. And there was one issue they simply could not resolve: slavery. It was the elephant in the room of the Constitutional Convention. The delegates argued for months about representation, taxation, the power of the presidency, and the structure of the courts. But the most difficult question of all was what to do about the institution of slavery. And what they did, or rather, what they failed to do, would haunt the nation for generations. Some of the founders, like Benjamin Franklin and Alexander Hamilton, opposed slavery on moral grounds. Others, like Thomas Jefferson, recognized its evil but could not imagine how to end it. And still others, particularly the delegates from the southern states, were determined to protect it at all costs. The result was a series of compromises. Southern delegates wanted enslaved people to be counted when determining how many representatives each state would have in the House. Northern delegates argued that if enslaved people were not allowed to vote, they should not be counted at all. The compromise they reached is now infamous. It became known as the 3/5 Compromise. For purposes of representation and taxation, each enslaved person would count as 3/5 of a free person. It was a cynical political bargain, and it gave the southern states far more political power than they would have had if only free citizens were counted. But that was only the beginning. The Constitution also included what became known as the Fugitive Slave Clause. It required that enslaved people who escaped to free states be returned to their owners. This was a direct concession to the southern states, and it meant that the federal government was explicitly involved in protecting the institution of slavery. And then there was the Slave Trade Clause. The founders agreed that Congress would not be allowed to ban the importation of enslaved people for 20 years, until 1808. This was another compromise, but it meant that for 2 full decades after the Constitution was adopted, the transatlantic slave trade would remain legal under the new government. Here is the uncomfortable truth that historians rarely emphasize. The founders knew exactly what they were doing. They understood that slavery was a moral evil. Many of them said so openly. But they also believed that the survival of the nation was more important. They convinced themselves that slavery would eventually die out on its own. They told themselves that future generations would find a way to solve the problem. James Madison, the primary author of the Constitution, wrote about the dilemma in his notes from the convention. He admitted that the slavery question was the most embarrassing issue they faced. He knew it was a contradiction at the heart of the new nation. But he and the others pushed the problem into the future. They left it for another generation to solve. And that decision, made in the summer of 1787, created a fault line that would eventually tear the country apart. If the founders knew that slavery was wrong, why did they protect it in the Constitution? Some historians argue that they had no choice. The Southern states would never have ratified the Constitution if it threatened slavery, and without those states, the United States could not have been formed. But there is another interpretation, one that suggests the founders were not simply practical. They were also deeply compromised by their own economic interests. Many of them owned enslaved people themselves. George Washington owned over 300. Thomas Jefferson owned over 600. They were not neutral arbiters of justice. They were men with wealth and power that depended on the very institution they claimed to despise. And that contradiction between the promise of liberty and the reality of bondage would never be resolved. It would only grow worse, because as the nation expanded westward, the question of slavery would follow it. Every new territory, every new state, every new piece of land would become a battleground, and the compromises that had held the nation together in 1787 would eventually fail. But that is the story of the next chapter. For now, understand this. The Civil War did not begin in 1861. It began in 1787, in a room in Philadelphia, where the founders made a choice that would eventually cost over 600,000 American lives. They planted the seeds of destruction. And now we must watch them grow. The year was 1819. The United States had just celebrated its 43rd birthday. The nation was still young, but it was growing fast. Settlers were pushing westward across the Appalachian Mountains, carving out new territories and new states. And with every new piece of land, the same question followed. Would slavery be allowed there? This was the question that had been pushed aside in 1787. The founders had hoped that future generations would find a solution. But by 1819, it was clear that they had only made the problem worse. The nation was expanding, and the fault line beneath it was expanding too. The crisis that erupted in 1819 began with Missouri. The territory had applied for statehood as a slave state. That was nothing new. Several southern states had already joined the Union. But this time was different. There were now exactly 11 free states and 11 slave states. The balance in the Senate was perfect. If Missouri entered as a slave state, the South would have a permanent advantage in Congress, and the North knew it. A congressman from New York named James Tallmadge proposed an amendment. He wanted to ban slavery in Missouri and require that all enslaved children born there be freed at age 25. It was a radical move, and it set off a firestorm. Southern politicians were furious. They argued that Congress had no right to dictate whether a territory could allow slavery. They called it a violation of states' rights. But the issue was far bigger than Missouri. The South realized that if Congress could ban slavery in Missouri, it could ban it anywhere. The entire future of the institution was at stake. The debate raged for over a year. The Senate passed the Missouri statehood bill without restrictions. The House passed it with restrictions. Neither side would budge. And then, In 1820, a deal was struck. It became known as the Missouri Compromise, and it was one of the most important pieces of legislation in American history. Maine, which had been part of Massachusetts, was admitted as a free state. Missouri was admitted as a slave state. The balance was preserved. But there was another part of the compromise, one that would define American politics for the next 30 years. A line was drawn across the Louisiana Purchase territory at the 36° 30 meters parallel. South of that line, slavery would be allowed. North of it, slavery would be prohibited, except for Missouri itself. It seemed like a solution. The nation had avoided a crisis. The Union was safe. But the Missouri Compromise was not a solution at all. It was a temporary postponement, and everyone knew it. In the years that followed, the compromise held, but the tension beneath the surface never disappeared. It only grew. The Southern economy was becoming more dependent on slavery than ever before. The invention of the cotton gin in 1793 had transformed American agriculture. Cotton became the most profitable crop in the world, and it could only be grown with slave labor. Between 1820 and 1850, the number of enslaved people in the South more than doubled. Cotton production exploded. The South was no longer just a region that tolerated slavery. It was a slave society. Every part of Southern life, its economy, its politics, its social structure, was built on the institution. And the North was changing too. Industrialization was transforming the Northern economy. Factories were replacing farms. Immigrants were flooding into northern cities. The North was becoming a modern capitalist society with wage labor, transportation networks, and a growing middle class. The two regions were not just different, they were becoming incompatible. The South looked at the North and saw a society that was trying to destroy its way of life. The North looked at the South and saw a society that was trapped in the barbarism of the past, and there was no compromise that could bridge that gap. But the politicians kept trying. They kept making deals. They kept kicking the problem down the road. And every time they did, the problem got worse. The Missouri Compromise had drawn a line across the continent, but it did not settle the question of whether slavery was right or wrong. It only settled the question of where it would be allowed. And as the nation continued to expand, that line would become increasingly difficult to maintain. The Mexican-American War in the 1840s brought new territories into the United States. California, New Mexico, Utah, and Texas all had to decide whether to allow slavery. The old compromise was no longer enough. Once again, the nation faced a crisis, and once again, the politicians looked for a solution. But this time, there would be no easy answer. The Missouri Compromise had worked for a generation, but it was built on a fragile assumption. It assumed that the North and South could continue to coexist, each with its own system, each minding its own business. That assumption was about to be shattered, because the question of slavery was no longer just about states' rights or economic policy. It was becoming a moral question. And when you introduce morality into politics, compromise becomes almost impossible. In the North, a growing movement called Abolitionism was demanding the immediate end of slavery. Men like William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass were using newspapers, speeches, and books to expose the brutal realities of slavery. They were making it impossible for Northerners to ignore the evil in their midst. In the South, defenders of slavery were becoming more aggressive. They argued that slavery was not just a necessary evil. They claimed it was a positive good. They argued that slavery was sanctioned by the Bible justified by science, and essential to civilization. Two Americas were emerging, and they were moving in opposite directions. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 had drawn a line across the continent, but the dividing line between North and South was becoming much more than a geographical boundary. It was becoming a line between two ways of life, two value systems, two visions of the future, and one of them would eventually have to prevail. That was the reality the nation could no longer ignore. But the politicians still tried. They still searched for a compromise that would hold the Union together. And in 1850, they found one. But that compromise would turn out to be the beginning of the end. To understand why the Civil War became inevitable, you have to understand one simple fact. In 1790, the United States produced practically no cotton. By 1860, the United States was producing over 2 billion pounds of it every single year. That transformation changed everything. The cotton gin, invented by Eli Whitney in 1793, made it possible to separate cotton fibers from seeds quickly and cheaply. Before the gin, cotton was a difficult and unprofitable crop to process. After the gin, it became the most valuable commodity in the world, and it could only be produced with slave labor. The cotton gin did not make slavery obsolete, as many had hoped. It did the exact opposite. It made slavery more profitable than ever. It transformed the American South into a cotton empire that stretched from Virginia all the way to Texas. By 1860, the South was producing over 60% of the world's cotton. The crop was worth more than all the factories, railroads, and banks in the North combined. Cotton fueled the American economy. It paid for the expansion of the United States. It financed the Industrial Revolution in New England. Cotton was king, and the throne was built on the backs of enslaved men, women, and children. This was the economic reality that made compromise impossible. The South knew that its entire way of life depended on slavery. Without enslaved labor, the cotton empire would collapse. The Southern elite would lose their wealth, their status, their power. They would do anything to protect that system. And the North, with its growing industrial economy, was increasingly unwilling to tolerate it. The abolitionist movement that emerged in the 1830s was not just a moral crusade, it was also a political and economic threat to the South. William Lloyd Garrison, the founder of the American Anti-Slavery Society, published a newspaper called The Liberator. In its very first issue, he wrote these words, "I will not equivocate, I will not excuse, I will not retreat a single inch, and I will be heard." Garrison was not interested in slow or gradual change. He demanded immediate emancipation. He called slavery a sin and a crime. He published stories of enslaved people being beaten, raped, and torn from their families. He made it impossible for Northerners to pretend that slavery was someone else's problem. But Garrison and his followers faced fierce resistance. Mobs attacked abolitionist meetings. Printers who published anti-slavery newspapers were threatened with violence. In 1837, a mob in Alton, Illinois, murdered Elijah Lovejoy, an abolitionist newspaper editor, and destroyed his printing press. Despite the violence, the abolitionist movement grew. Frederick Douglass, a former enslaved man who had escaped to freedom, became one of the most powerful voices in the nation. He spoke with a first-hand knowledge of slavery's horrors that no white abolitionist could match. His autobiography, published in 1845, became an international bestseller and exposed the brutality of the slave system to millions of readers. Douglass, and others like him, made the moral case against slavery in terms that were impossible to ignore. They asked, how could a nation, founded on the principle that all men are created equal, continue to hold millions in bondage? How could Americans call themselves the champions of liberty while denying freedom to an entire race of people? These questions cut to the very soul of the nation, and they forced every American to choose a side. In the South, defenders of slavery responded with a new and radical argument. They stopped apologizing for slavery and started celebrating it. In 1837, John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, one of the most influential politicians of his era, took to the floor of the Senate and declared that slavery was not a necessary evil. It was a positive good. Calhoun argued that slavery was the best foundation for a civilized society. He claimed that it protected the laboring class from the exploitation of capitalism. He claimed that enslaved people were better fed, better clothed, and better treated than free workers in northern factories. He claimed that slavery was the natural condition of the Negro race, and that the Bible itself sanctioned it. These arguments may sound shocking to modern ears, but they were taken seriously by many Southerners. They provided a moral justification for a system that was becoming increasingly hard to defend on any other grounds. The South was no longer just protecting an economic institution, it was defending a way of life, and it was willing to go to war to preserve it. Meanwhile, the nation continued to expand. New territories were acquired, new states were admitted. And with each new piece of land, the question grew louder: would slavery be allowed? The Missouri Compromise had drawn a line across the Louisiana Purchase, but now the nation had acquired new territory from Mexico, and that line was no longer sufficient. The debate over whether slavery should be allowed in the new territories became the central issue of American politics. A new generation of politicians, including a little-known lawyer from Illinois named Abraham Lincoln, entered the debate. Lincoln argued that slavery was morally wrong and that it should not be allowed to spread into the new territories. He warned that the nation could not survive half slave and half free. Lincoln's words were prophetic, because the nation was indeed becoming a house divided, and a house divided cannot stand. By 1850, the United States was a nation on the edge. The territorial gains from the Mexican-American War had opened up a vast new region stretching from Texas to California, and the question of whether slavery would be allowed in these territories was tearing the country apart. The politicians of the era, men like Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, and Stephen Douglas, believed they could solve the problem through compromise. They had done it before. They believed they could do it again. But they were about to discover that some problems cannot be solved by compromise. Some problems can only be postponed. The Compromise of 1850 was the last great achievement of the generation of politicians who had grown up with the founders. It was a sweeping package of legislation designed to settle the territorial question once and for all. California was admitted as a free state. The territories of New Mexico and Utah were organized without any restriction on slavery. The slave trade, though not slavery itself, was abolished in Washington, D.C., and most controversially, a new and much stricter Fugitive Slave Act was passed. The Fugitive Slave Act was the South's price for accepting California as a free state. It required that all escaped enslaved people be returned to their owners, even if they had reached free states. It required federal marshals to assist in the capture and return of fugitives, and it denied accused fugitives the right to a jury trial or to testify on their own behalf. For Northerners, this was a bridge too far. The Fugitive Slave Act effectively made every citizen a potential slave catcher. It required Northerners to participate in the enforcement of slavery, something many found morally repugnant. Thousands of Northerners who had been indifferent to the slavery question were now outraged. The act also sparked massive resistance. Northern states passed personal liberty laws designed to protect escaped enslaved people and obstruct the enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Act. Abolitionists organized underground networks to help enslaved people escape to freedom. The Underground Railroad, a loose network of safe houses and secret routes, helped thousands of enslaved people reach freedom in the North and Canada. The Fugitive Slave Act had been intended to strengthen the Union. Instead, it radicalized the North and deepened the divide between the sections. But the real turning point came 4 years later, in 1854. That was the year Senator Stephen Douglas of Illinois introduced a bill that would forever change the course of American history. Douglas was one of the most powerful men in Washington. He was ambitious, intelligent, and deeply committed to the expansion of the United States. He wanted to build a transcontinental railroad that would connect the East Coast to California, and he believed the best route for that railroad would run through the Nebraska Territory. But there was a problem. The Nebraska Territory lay north of the 36 degrees 30' line established by the Missouri Compromise. Under the terms of that compromise, slavery was prohibited there. Douglas knew that Southern senators would never approve the organization of the territory if it meant excluding slavery. They would block his railroad. So Douglas made a calculation. He would propose a bill that would organize the territory and leave the question of slavery to the settlers themselves. This principle became known as popular sovereignty. The idea was that the people of the territory would decide for themselves whether to allow slavery. But Douglas knew that popular sovereignty was not enough. The Missouri Compromise still stood as a barrier, so he proposed to repeal it. He wrote a bill that explicitly abolished the Missouri Compromise line and opened the entire region to slavery. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, as it became known, was one of the most consequential pieces of legislation in American history. It passed with the support of Southern Democrats and a few Northern Democrats who were willing to compromise for the sake of political stability. But the bill set off a firestorm in the North. Northerners were outraged. They saw the repeal of the Missouri Compromise as a betrayal. They believed that the South was trying to extend slavery into every corner of the nation. They believed that the political system had been hijacked by slave power. A new political party was born out of this outrage. It was called the Republican Party. The Republicans were not abolitionists. They did not demand the immediate end of slavery, but they were firmly committed to preventing its expansion into the territories. They believed that if slavery was confined to the South, it would eventually die out. The Republican Party quickly became the most powerful political force in the North. It absorbed former Whigs, anti-slavery Democrats, and free soil advocates. It was a coalition built on one central principle: opposition to the spread of slavery. And that principle made compromise with the South almost impossible. The immediate consequence of the Kansas-Nebraska Act was violence. The territory of Kansas, which had been opened to popular sovereignty, became a battleground. Pro-slavery settlers from Missouri crossed the border to vote in the territorial elections. Anti-slavery settlers from the North rushed into Kansas to counter them. Both sides were determined to win. Kansas descended into a brutal guerrilla war. Pro-slavery forces attacked anti-slavery settlements. Anti-slavery forces struck back. Homes were burned. People were killed. Newspapers called it Bleeding Kansas. It was a preview of the war that was to come. The violence in Kansas shocked the nation. It showed that the compromise system had failed. It showed that the slavery question could not be resolved peacefully. It showed that the nation was sliding toward war, and the worst was yet to come. In 1856, a pro-slavery mob attacked the town of Lawrence, Kansas, an anti-slavery stronghold. They burned buildings and destroyed printing presses. In response, a radical abolitionist named John Brown led a group of his followers to a pro-slavery settlement along Pottawatomie Creek. They dragged 5 men from their homes and hacked them to death with broadswords. John Brown became a hero to some and a villain to others, but his actions made one thing clear. The slavery debate was no longer confined to the halls of Congress. It was being settled with blood. In the Senate, the same year, a violent attack occurred that shocked the entire nation. Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts, a leading abolitionist, delivered a speech denouncing pro-slavery forces in Kansas. He personally attacked Senator Andrew Butler of South Carolina, accusing him of defending the institution of slavery. 2 days later, Butler's nephew, Representative Preston Brooks, entered the Senate chamber and beat Sumner unconscious with a heavy cane. Brooks struck Sumner over and over again, even after he had collapsed to the floor. Sumner suffered severe head injuries and was unable to return to the Senate for 3 years. The attack on Sumner symbolized the breakdown of civility in American politics. It showed that the political system was failing. Men who disagreed were no longer debating. They were trying to kill each other. By 1856, the nation was in crisis. The political parties were fractured. The old compromises had failed. The violence in Kansas and the attack on Sumner had exposed the deep divisions that the politicians could no longer contain. And the future of the nation was uncertain. But there was one man who had been watching all of this with growing concern. His name was Abraham Lincoln. He had returned to politics after a long absence, driven by the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. He believed that the nation's survival depended on preventing the spread of slavery, and he was about to confront the greatest political figure of his generation in a series of debates that would change the course of American history. The year 1857 should have been a victory for the South. The Supreme Court was dominated by Southern justices. The President, James Buchanan, was sympathetic to Southern interests, and the court was about to issue a ruling that many believed would settle the slavery question once and for all. The case was Dred Scott v. Sanford. Dred Scott was an enslaved man who had been taken by his owner to free territory and then returned to Missouri. Scott sued for his freedom, arguing that his residence in free territory had made him a free man. The Supreme Court had an opportunity to issue a narrow ruling, one that would apply only to Scott's specific situation. Instead, they issued a sweeping decision that would transform American politics. Chief Justice Roger Taney, a former slaveholder from Maryland, wrote the majority opinion. He declared that no person of African descent could be a citizen of the United States. They had no rights that white men were bound to respect. He also declared that Congress had no power to prohibit slavery in the territories. The Missouri Compromise, Taney ruled, had been unconstitutional from the start. The Dred Scott decision was a bombshell. It meant that the federal government could not restrict slavery anywhere. It meant that slavery could potentially spread to every corner of the United States. It meant that the Republican Party's central principle, the containment of slavery, was unconstitutional. Northerners were horrified. They saw the decision as proof that the South had taken control of all 3 branches of government. They saw it as a conspiracy to extend slavery across the entire nation. For Southerners, the decision was a triumph. The Supreme Court had validated their position. Slavery was not just a state right, it was a constitutional right that could not be infringed by any law. But the decision did not settle the question. It only made the crisis worse. The Republicans refused to accept the ruling. They argued that the decision was a political act by a partisan court. They vowed to fight it. And then came John Brown. In October 1859, Brown led a small group of followers in a raid on the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. His goal was to seize the weapons and arm enslaved people for a massive revolt that would sweep through the South. Brown believed that God had called him to destroy slavery by any means necessary. The raid was a failure. Brown and his men were quickly surrounded by federal troops led by Colonel Robert E. Lee. Most of Brown's men were killed. Brown himself was captured, tried for treason, and sentenced to death. Brown could have been forgotten as a failed fanatic, but his execution transformed him into a martyr for the abolitionist cause. He went to the gallows with a dignity that moved the nation. In his final speech, he told the court that he believed it was right to fight against slavery and that he was willing to die for that belief. For Northerners, Brown became a hero. Ralph Waldo Emerson called him a saint. Henry David Thoreau compared him to Christ. Thousands of Northerners mourned his death and saw him as a symbol of righteousness in a corrupt nation. For Southerners, Brown was proof of what they had always feared. The North was not just opposed to slavery. They were actively plotting to destroy it. They were supporting terrorists who wanted to arm enslaved people and slaughter white families. The South saw Brown's raid as a preview of what would happen if they remained in the Union. The nation had reached a breaking point. And then came the election of 1860. The Democratic Party, which had once been the only national political institution that still held the country together, split into factions. Northern Democrats nominated Stephen Douglas, who still believed in popular sovereignty. Southern Democrats nominated John C. Breckinridge, who demanded federal protection of slavery in the territories. A third party, the Constitutional Union Party, tried to avoid the issue altogether. The Republicans nominated Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln was not an abolitionist. He had never called for the immediate end of slavery, but he was firmly committed to preventing its expansion, and that was enough to terrify the South. Lincoln won the election with a decisive victory. He carried every northern state. He won only a tiny fraction of the Southern vote. He was elected by the North alone. And for the South, that was the final straw. They had lost control of the presidency. They had lost control of Congress. They feared that Lincoln and the Republicans would eventually destroy their way of life. They believed that their only choice was to leave the Union before it was too late. South Carolina was the first to act. In December 1860, the state called a convention and voted unanimously to secede from the United States. Other southern states followed quickly. Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas all left the Union. In February 1861, they formed a new nation. They called it the Confederate States of America. They elected Jefferson Davis as their president. Davis was a former Secretary of War and a veteran of the Mexican-American War. He was respected, experienced, and committed to the Confederate cause. In his inaugural address, Davis explained the Confederacy's founding principle. He said that the new nation was built on the truth that slavery was the natural condition of the African race. He said that the Confederacy was created to protect that institution from the aggression of the North. The Confederacy had been born, and the Union was shattered. But the war had not yet begun. There was still a chance, however slim, that the crisis could be resolved peacefully. President Buchanan, a lame duck who had been powerless to stop the secession, did nothing. He left the problem for Lincoln to solve. Lincoln was inaugurated on March 4, 1861. In his inaugural address, he appealed to the South to return to the Union. He promised not to interfere with slavery where it already existed. He promised to enforce the fugitive slave laws. But he also made it clear that the Union was perpetual, that secession was unconstitutional, and that he would not allow the South to leave without a fight. And that is when the war began. There is a myth that has persisted for over 150 years. The myth is that the Civil War was not about slavery. It was about states' rights. It was about the federal government encroaching on the sovereignty of the southern states. It was about economic differences. It was about tariffs and taxes. This myth is one of the most successful propaganda campaigns in American history. It was created after the war by former Confederate leaders and their sympathizers. It was designed to vindicate the Confederacy and to obscure the true cause of the war. And it continues to be repeated today. But here is the truth. The Confederacy was founded on the principle that slavery was the foundation of civilization, and the leaders of the Confederacy said so themselves. They did not hide their reasons. They were proud of them. In March 1861, Alexander Stephens, the Vice President of the Confederacy, gave a speech in Savannah, Georgia. It has become known as the Cornerstone speech, and it is one of the most important historical documents in American history. Stephens began by explaining why the Confederacy had seceded. He said that the Confederate States had left the Union because the North had rejected the institution of slavery. He said that the Confederacy was founded on the opposite principle. He said that the Confederacy was built on the great truth that the Negro race was inferior to the white race. He said that slavery was the natural condition of the Negro, and that the Confederacy was created to preserve that condition. These are Stephens's exact words. Our new government is founded upon exactly the opposite idea. Its foundations are laid. Its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to the superior race, is his natural and normal condition. Stephens was not a fringe figure. He was the second highest official in the Confederate government. He was speaking on behalf of the new nation. He was explaining its founding principles to the world. And those principles were clear. The Confederacy was created to preserve and protect slavery. But the Cornerstone speech was not the only evidence. The Confederate Constitution itself made the same point. It explicitly protected slavery. It prohibited the Confederate government from passing any law that would restrict slavery. It guaranteed that enslaved people would remain enslaved in any Confederate territory. It was a constitution written to protect the institution of slavery. Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, also made his position clear. He said that the Confederacy had been created to protect the institution of African slavery. He said that the North had attempted to subvert the institution and that the South had no choice but to leave the Union. Every major Confederate leader, from Davis to Stephens to Robert E. Lee to Stonewall Jackson, defended slavery. They did not see it as a necessary evil. They saw it as a positive good. They believed that the white race was superior to the Negro race. They believed that slavery was the best system for both races. So why does the myth persist? Why do so many Americans still believe that the Civil War was about states' rights? The answer lies in the years after the war. The South was devastated. The Confederacy had been defeated, but the Southern leaders were determined to win the peace. They began a propaganda campaign that historians call the Lost Cause. The Lost Cause was a deliberate effort to rewrite the history of the war. Its goal was to vindicate the Confederacy and to restore the honor of the South. It argued that the Confederacy had fought for noble principles, not for slavery. It argued that the Confederacy had been defeated only because the North had overwhelming numbers and resources. It argued that the Confederacy had fought for states' rights, for liberty, for the Southern way of life. The Lost Cause narrative was spread through books, speeches, monuments, and textbooks. It was promoted by former Confederate soldiers and politicians. It was embraced by Southern historians and educators. It became the dominant story of the war for generations. And it was a lie. The Cornerstone speech was suppressed. It was not taught in schools. It was not included in history textbooks. It was forgotten by most Americans. But the words of Alexander Stephens remain. They are a permanent record of the Confederacy's true purpose. They show that the Confederacy was built on slavery. They show that the Civil War was, at its core, a war to preserve the institution of human bondage. The Lost Cause myth has been remarkably durable. It persists today in arguments about Confederate monuments, in debates about the Confederate flag, in discussions about the causes of the war. But the historical evidence is overwhelming. The Confederacy was a nation founded on slavery. That is not an opinion, it is a fact. And the evidence is there for anyone willing to look. The Civil War ended on April 9, 1865, when Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. The Confederacy was defeated. Slavery was abolished. The Union was preserved. But the war for the meaning of the war had only just begun. In the years after Appomattox, the South was devastated. Cities lay in ruins. The economy was shattered. More than 260,000 Confederate soldiers had died. The people of the South faced the daunting task of rebuilding their lives in a world that had been turned upside down. But the military defeat did not destroy the Confederate spirit. Many Southerners remained defiant. They were determined to preserve their honor and their way of life, even if they could no longer preserve slavery. And they were determined to control the story of the war. This is where the Lost Cause began. The Lost Cause was not just a historical interpretation. It was a political movement. It was a cultural campaign. It was a psychological defense mechanism designed to help the South cope with the trauma of defeat. It gave Southerners a noble story to tell themselves about why they had fought and why they had lost. The leading architect of the Lost Cause was Jefferson Davis. After the war, Davis wrote a massive 2-volume memoir called The Rise and Fall of the Confederate Government. In it, he argued that the Confederacy had been justified in seceding. He argued that the Southern states had the right to leave the Union. He argued that the war was not about slavery, but about states' rights. He argued that the Confederacy had fought for constitutional principles, not for the preservation of human bondage. Davis's account was not accurate, but it was influential. It provided a framework for other Lost Cause writers and historians to build upon. Another key figure was Jubal Early, a Confederate general who had fought in many of the war's most important battles. After the war, Early became the leading voice of the Lost Cause. He wrote articles and gave speeches defending the Confederacy. He blamed the defeat on the overwhelming resources of the North, not on any flaw in the Confederate cause. He argued that Robert E. Lee was the greatest general in American history. He argued that the South had been betrayed by incompetent subordinates at Gettysburg. Early's efforts were part of a broader campaign to elevate Lee to the status of an American hero and to transform the Confederacy into a noble lost cause. This effort was remarkably successful. Lee became a figure of national reverence, admired by Northerners and Southerners alike. He was seen as a man of honor, dignity, and military genius, not as a defender of slavery. The lost cause also led to the creation of a vast network of monuments and memorials across the South. Between 1890 and 1920, hundreds of Confederate monuments were erected in town squares, cemeteries, and government buildings. They were not just memorials to the dead, they were statements of political defiance. They were symbols of the belief that the South had been right. The lost cause narrative was also promoted by the United Daughters of the Confederacy, an organization founded in 1894. The UDC raised money for monuments, lobbied for textbooks that presented the lost cause version of history, and worked to preserve Confederate heritage. They were remarkably effective. By the early 20th century, the lost cause had become the dominant interpretation of the Civil War in American culture. The lost cause narrative had several key elements. First, it argued that slavery was not the cause of the war. Instead, it claimed that the war was about states' rights and the defense of Southern liberty. Second, it argued that the Confederacy was defeated not because it was wrong, but because the North had overwhelming numbers and resources. Third, it argued that slavery was a benign institution and that enslaved people were loyal and content. Fourth, it argued that Reconstruction had been a terrible mistake, a period of Northern oppression and Southern suffering. Fifth, it argued that the Confederacy represented the true spirit of American liberty and that its leaders were heroes worthy of admiration. All of these claims were false. Slavery was the cause of the war. The Confederacy was defeated because it was outmatched in every category, but also because its cause was unsustainable. Slavery was brutal and inhumane. Reconstruction was a necessary effort to rebuild the South and secure the rights of the newly freed. And the Confederacy was not a noble experiment in liberty. It was an attempt to create a nation dedicated to the preservation of human bondage. But the lost cause narrative was powerful. It allowed Southerners to maintain their pride in the face of defeat. It allowed them to see themselves as defenders of a noble cause, not as losers of a war to preserve slavery. It allowed them to resist the changes brought by Reconstruction and to maintain white supremacy in the post-war South. The lost cause was not just about the past. It was about the present. It was about maintaining white control over the South. It was about justifying the Jim Crow laws that disenfranchised African Americans and segregated Southern society. It was about ensuring that the South would remain a white-dominated region. The lost cause narrative was so successful that it became the mainstream interpretation of the Civil War for much of American history. It was taught in schools. It appeared in movies like Gone with the Wind. It was repeated by politicians and historians. It became the story that most Americans learned about the war. But the truth never disappeared. The Cornerstone speech, the Confederate Constitution, the writings of Jefferson Davis and Alexander Stephens, all remained. They were evidence of what the Confederacy truly was. And over time, historians began to recover that truth. In the 20th century, a new generation of historians challenged the lost cause narrative. They examined the evidence. They read the primary sources. They discovered that the lost cause was not history. It was mythology. It was a deliberate distortion of the past, designed to vindicate a failed rebellion. By the 1960s, The lost cause had been largely discredited by academic historians, but the myth persisted in popular culture. It persisted in Southern memory. It persisted in monuments and textbooks and school curricula. Even today, the lost cause continues to influence how Americans think about the Civil War. Polls show that a significant percentage of Americans still believe that the war was about states' rights, not slavery. The debate over Confederate monuments continues to divide the nation. The symbols of the Confederacy remain controversial. The Lost Cause is one of the most successful propaganda campaigns in American history, but it is also one of the most harmful. It has distorted our understanding of the nation's past. It has perpetuated myths about race and slavery. It has made it more difficult to confront the legacy of the Civil War. And now, in the final chapter of this documentary, we must ask ourselves, why does the Civil War still matter today? The Civil War ended over 160 years ago, but in many ways, it has never truly ended. The issues that divided the nation in 1861 are still with us. The debate over race, equality, and the meaning of American freedom continues to shape our politics, our culture, and our identity. The Civil War was not a distant event that has nothing to do with modern America. It is the foundation upon which modern America was built. Consider the Constitution. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment guaranteed citizenship and equal protection under the law. The 15th Amendment guaranteed the right to vote regardless of race. These amendments were the direct result of the Civil War. They transformed the Constitution and reshaped American democracy. But the promise of these amendments was not fully realized. For nearly a century after the war, African Americans in the South were subjected to Jim Crow laws, segregation, and systematic disenfranchisement. It took the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s to begin to fulfill the promise of Reconstruction, and even today, the struggle for racial justice continues. The Civil War also shaped the balance of power between the federal government and the states. Before the war, many Americans believed that the states were sovereign and that the federal government had limited authority. The war settled that question once and for all. The federal government was supreme. Secession was unconstitutional. The Union was perpetual. But the debate over states' rights did not disappear. It continues in arguments over federal power, regulation, and the role of government in American life. The Civil War established the principle that the federal government could act decisively to protect the rights of all Americans. But the tension between federal and state authority remains a central feature of American politics. The Civil War also transformed the American economy. The war accelerated industrialization in the North. It led to the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. It created a national banking system. It laid the foundation for the modern American economy. But the economic legacy of the war is complex. The South, devastated by the war, remained economically backward for generations. The region struggled to recover from the destruction of the war and the end of slavery. The economic inequality between North and South persisted well into the 20th century. And then there is the question of memory. How do we remember the Civil War? How do we honor the dead? How do we confront the legacy of slavery and the Confederacy? These questions have become increasingly urgent in recent years. The debate over Confederate monuments has divided communities and sparked protests. Some argue that the monuments should be removed because they honor traitors and defenders of slavery. Others argue that the monuments are part of American history and should be preserved. These debates are not just about statues. They are about who we are as a nation. They are about whether we are willing to confront the full truth of our history. They are about whether we can move beyond the divisions of the past to build a more just and unified future. The Civil War was the most transformative event in American history. It redefined the nation's identity. It ended the institution of slavery. It preserved the Union. It set the stage for the modern American state. But it also left deep wounds that have never fully healed. The war created a legacy of racial division that continues to haunt the nation. It created a sectional identity that remains powerful in the South. It created a political divide that persists in debates over federal power, states' rights, and the meaning of equality. The Civil War was not inevitable. It was the result of choices made by politicians, citizens, and leaders over generations. It was the product of political failure, economic conflict, and moral blindness. It was a tragedy that could have been avoided, but it happened, and we must live with the consequences. Understanding the true origin of the Civil War is essential for understanding America. It is essential for understanding who we are and who we want to be. It is essential for confronting the legacy of slavery and racism that continues to shape our society. The Civil War was not just about slavery. It was about the future of the nation. It was about whether the United States would remain a slave-holding republic or become a truly free society. It was about whether the promises of the Declaration of Independence would be fulfilled for all Americans. The Civil War was fought over slavery. The evidence is overwhelming. The words of the Confederate leaders are clear. The documents of the era are unambiguous. But the war was also about something deeper. It was about whether the American experiment in democracy could survive. It was about whether a nation founded on the principle that all men are created equal could endure. The answer to that question is still being written.